So I will introduce you in about 30 seconds. And here we go. Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today we're going to have a little excursion into the abolition of nuclear weapons. Are you up for such a daunting challenge? It's not easy, I warn you. I've been working on this a while. It's a big job, and we haven't got very far. In fact, it looks to me like the nuclear weapons are getting more popular these days as the US and some of the other countries try to build more arsenals or modernize theirs. So we've got to work on that. And I have two people here who have the same concern about the issue as I do. Ward Wilson is in Illinois, living someplace outside of Chicago. Say hello, Ward. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. And in Sudbury, Ontario is Richard Denton. Richard is a very dear friend who's always comes to my aid when I need somebody to talk to somebody else. So I want somebody to help me talk to Ward, because we're going to talk about realism today. Realism in trying to promote the abolition of nuclear weapons. And Richard Denton is a retired physician, and he is a very big honcho in the Rotary Club and the co-president, I gather, or something like that, of the North American branch of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. So he spends a lot of time talking about nuclear issues. And that's on our minds today. How do we get people to think straight about nuclear weapons? Ward is working on a new book. We talked about another book of his previously, but today we're going to talk about his ideas for a new book and see if Richard and I agree with him about how to tackle this challenge. So Ward, give us your pitch. How should we how should we convince people to abolish nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the first thing is that this is an entirely new approach. As far as I can tell, and I've worked on this issue for 40 years and published in military journals and anti-nuclear journals and the New York Times and on and on. Traveled around the world, given talks in 22 countries on 5 continents. As far as I can tell, this is an approach that hasn't been used at any time in the previous 60 years. What it does is it combines a common sense realism. I'm not talking about realism in international relations theory, which as far as I'm concerned is not very realistic. I'm talking about the kind of realism that ordinary people have, fact-based, unsentimental, but still aware that emotions exist. And using that approach to build a case for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And the overview, the brief overview is, I think there are reasons to doubt the current consensus about nuclear weapons. I think the ideas were mostly formed during the Cold War when people were afraid, and they probably got distorted by those emotions. And there are very few facts about nuclear weapons. So there are reasons to question the reliability of the ideas that are widely accepted and that the small group of experts and government officials push very hard. The second thing is that people say that nuclear weapons will never go away. Particularly nuclear advocates say this. And the problem is that they think of the elimination of nuclear, they think of technology as a kind of Pandora's box story. That once a technology gets out of the box, you can never stuff it back in. And that's a familiar story, but it's a morality tale. And it actually has nothing to do with the way that technology actually evolves and goes away. So I think the reasons to doubt the original ideas, the notion about whether or not nuclear weapons will always exist is flawed. And if you look at the utility, if the way that technology goes away is based on utility by and large. If something's useful, you keep it. If it isn't, or something that's more useful comes along, then you throw it away. You don't have to disinvent it. That's a red herring. So if we look at the notion of utility and apply it to nuclear weapons, what you find is two things. They're not very useful on the battlefield, and that's based on historical fact. The history of battlefield use of nuclear weapons is almost zero. And what little history there is and the studies that have been done show that military people, everyone dislikes the notion of using nuclear weapons on the battlefield for obvious reasons. They're obviously not going to be very effective. And the second thing is nuclear deterrence works, but it can't work perfectly. And so it's bound to fail. And it's a formula for catastrophe. So that's if you have a piece of technology that is both dangerous and not very useful, no one keeps that kind of technology. So the problem isn't to force people to give up a magic technology that can do anything, which is essentially what people say nuclear weapons are. They keep the peace, they solidify our alliances, they give us prestige, they give us magic military power. Problem isn't to get people to get rid of really, really desirable weapons. That's not the task. The task is to convince people to face the reality. Reality is they're pretty clumsy weapons, not very useful. And if we continue to rely on deterrence, we'll end up in a catastrophic war. So that's the nutshell.
Okay, you say nobody has done this approach before. It doesn't sound that novel to me, frankly. I'm pretty sure I've made the same arguments one way or another a number of times. Richard, how about you?
You're muted, Richard.
I certainly agree with you, Ward, that nuclear weapons are not just bigger, better bombs. And that's what a lot of people think of them as. They don't realize that they will put dirt up into the atmosphere and cause nuclear winter that will then wipe out crops, creating mass starvation of billions of people. And two, they don't realize the problem of radiation, which also goes around the world and again becomes another global problem like current COVID and climate crisis. What we as doctors have done is pointed out the humanitarian aspect of nuclear weapons and pointed out how it...
I don't think they're very humanitarian.
Well, exactly. That's the point, is that they are not humanitarian, that all the targets are civilian cities, not military targets. And so it's the cities and civilians that are the problem. They're indiscriminate and the effects are long lasting. So they destroy the environment and they destroy everything around the world. And so again, using nuclear weapons as suicide, or what was the old term was mutually assured destruction, MAD. And so not only are they immoral, insane, illogical, they're now illegal. And so we now have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will stigmatize them and hopefully persuade the 9 nuclear countries to get rid of them. I think also to get rid of them, it's, to me, I'm a former mayor, and in politics, to me, everything comes down to money. And we're just spending tremendous amounts of money on nuclear weapons. And so what we need to do is to start divesting from that. And so the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, that got the Nobel Peace Prize 2017, has a program along with PACs to don't bank on the bomb, to divest money from the military to treating pandemics, to treating the climate crisis, to prevent or treating health and all the other good things that we need to be doing on a humanitarian basis. So it's, I would say that while I think facts, we'd like to use facts to convince people, I'm not sure that they actually do. Certainly, I think we need to educate the population about the evils of nuclear weapons, and certainly getting another book out there is great, because that's we'll get it out. I think what works better are movies, videos, and of course now Twitter and Facebook and the other social media are much better at getting our message out. So I think one is to utilize those to get the message out. Two is to convince the people that make nuclear weapons that they can make money on doing other things. And so like Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Honeywell, all of these large companies, not only do they make nuclear weapons, but they do make other things, and they do make a profit on these other things. So the thing is to not loan them money, and hopefully get them to divest and put it into other organization or other manufacturing. And I think the problem is it all comes down to also to jobs. And in the United States, these companies have their weapons making in all the 50 states. And so they say, well, if you don't fund us, people will lose jobs. But people make many more jobs doing healthcare, doing education, teaching, and other types of manufacturing than they do from the military. So I think those are arguments that can be made as well.
It seems to me that there are two different issues here, at least. One is whether or not the most productive or most promising way of convincing people is to use reason and explain why it's contrary to their own interests to go on maintaining a nuclear arsenal, so using rational arguments, or whether some sort of moral and humanitarian appeal to their position as remember your humanity as part of the Pugwash slogan, sort of the Russell Einstein appeal, I think. And whether or not this personal, emotional, humanitarian motivation is the one that's most likely to get people to change their position, or whether, looking at their pocketbook or the effectiveness of the weapons and so on, which one works better. And I would have to say that, I probably was convinced of using reason in almost exclusively until the ICANN movement made its great success on the basis of humanitarian appeal. Seems to me that by switching and showing, look here, the images of what you've actually done with nuclear weapons, and they show people and they tell stories and they show the wreckage and the damage and the pain that has been caused, and it worked. They got the TPNW out of that. So I think that is a really important question. The other part of it, from my point of view, is whether reasoning works at all. My experience with trying to reason with people is, in fact, you've given all the best arguments for getting rid of nuclear weapons, and I agree with every one of them, but it has never worked very much. I've never seen anybody actually change their point of view when I've trotted out any of these arguments. And when I say you've done it, I mean, Ward, these points you made originally are valid, but I haven't been able to persuade anybody to say become a peace activist and work to abolish nuclear weapons just because I've been able to show that they're not a very good thing to own rationally. I find that what people really want them for is not because they're going to be effective or useful or pragmatically of any value, but just for prestige. That people think, well, my country, we're going to show you that we're really a big country and an important country in the world too, because we're going to have nuclear weapons. And in fact, right now, that's what's going on in Britain. They have these new Trident weapons. They're going to get more of them, apparently, for their submarines. And when I've talked to people who are experts, and they have talked to the government people, and they've asked them, what do you want these for? Why do you need more of them? What's the matter here? And the government people don't even try to give a decent answer to it. And the answer is, it shows that we're powerful country. Britain is, the old England is coming back, and we're going to be a great power again. And the proof is we'll have a really big nuclear arsenal. I think that's what it's for. Unfortunately, that does carry weight. Countries that have nuclear arsenals are feared more, and I wouldn't say respected more, but they certainly have more influence in the world than countries that don't, in a lot of ways. Okay, now I hope we've ganged up on you, Ward.
Well, okay, so let me just review. I say I have an exciting new approach that hasn't been tried. Meta says she doesn't believe it's true. And I think that you can build a realist case against nuclear weapons. And Richard thinks that you need a humanitarian case. And Meta thinks that arguing rationally doesn't work. So let me begin by one of the things I did when I was trying to shape what I perceived as a new approach was to talk to anti-nuclear weapons activists. And one of the things I found was an enormous resistance to talking about realist arguments. And in my frustration, I was in Costa Rica talking to Oscar Arias, who's a former president and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I said, how do I convince people that although it is absolutely undoubtedly true that nuclear weapons are immoral, and although there is no question that nuclear war would be a humanitarian catastrophe, how do I convince people that there's a missing element, something else that needs to be added to the mix? And he looked at me, and I still think about it with amazement, because it shows how a master politician works. He won a Nobel Peace Prize and brought peace to Central America and solved 2 civil wars. There's a reason why he was able to do that. He looked at me and he said, it's not working. The fact is, the old arguments have been in place for 70 years. Moral arguments have been applied to the nuclear weapons issue for decades. Today, the nuclear armed states, now what ICANN has done to motivate the non-nuclear weapon states is remarkable. Now, I was in Nayarit, in the room, when the diplomats from the non-nuclear weapon states found their voice, so to speak. We were supposed to end at 1 with a summary by the chair, but diplomats from around the world kept wanting to get up and say something else, because they had discovered that they not only had a right to talk about nuclear weapons, they had something they wanted to say. It was very moving. But the fact is, the nuclear armed states have doubled down. They're increasing their nuclear arsenals. After 60 years, the best that we can do is to stand by helpless while governments build new kinds of weapons, increase the number of weapons that we have. We don't have a mass movement. The last mass movement in the 80s shriveled up and went away after Reagan and Reykjavik, and there seemed to be large reductions in nuclear weapons. So I think that it makes sense to explore other alternatives. There's another reason why it makes sense to keep in mind the realist arguments. In the United States, at least, the trope that nuclear weapons advocates use most often to diminish the value of nuclear weapons arguments against nuclear weapons, is they say that the debate is a debate between realists and idealists, and the anti-nuclear people are the idealists. And that means that the anti-nuclear people will always lose. Because if your life is in danger, you want a realistic plan. You don't want an idealistic plan. Maybe 1-2% of people, Christ, Gandhi, would want an idealistic plan. But for the most part, people want a realistic plan. Seems to me that unless you can build a realistic case against nuclear weapons, you won't be able to convince the mass, at least of Americans. When I talk to Americans, the biggest hurdle, ordinary people on the street, the biggest hurdle I face is that they think it's idealism. They think I'm arguing moral arguments. Even when I explicitly say I'm not interested in morality, the frame in their mind is that the arguments against nuclear weapons are moral arguments, and I don't want to hear them because I know it's a risk we have to run, and so why should I worry? And as far as not having success, I use this argument in a number of cases. I've been promoting this point of view for 5 or 6 years. My experience at the New York Military Affairs Symposium is maybe it's representative. I come in and these are all kind of military hobbyists and retired military people and folks from New York City, and there's 50 people in the room. The guy in the front row says, oh, I'm gonna have some tough questions for you. I don't believe this anti-nuclear stuff. When I was done, I had the room. I had won that room full of people, and people came up and asked how they could give money. And the guy who said he was going to have tough questions, the ex-military guy, said, I agree with you 100%. So I think these arguments can have an impact on ordinary Americans because they're commonsensical and because they are framed in such a way that they don't talk about the obvious immorality of nuclear weapons. No one needs to be told the nuclear weapons are immoral. It's clear. And there would be a catastrophe if there were ever nuclear war. But they think that they have to stick with nuclear weapons because they've been convinced that in a tight place, when nothing else will work, nuclear weapons are a necessity to have. And you've got to dispel that necessity argument, I think. Otherwise, you'll never build a mass movement against nuclear weapons. I could be wrong.
I wish that I could remember a single time when I have actually converted anybody or even seen anybody be converted right in front of my eyes.
I gave a talk at Nagasaki, and afterwards, one of the kids that was in the room gave a talk at the PrepCom at the UN. And one of the things he said, I wasn't there, but somebody tweeted out what he said. He said, Ward Wilson convinced me that it's possible to get rid of nuclear weapons. Oscar Arias reviewed the manuscript for this book and said, I think that this book makes me believe that it's possible to eliminate nuclear weapons in my lifetime. Lee Butler, who's a former commander of STRATCOM, reviewed the manuscript and called it the most compelling case against nuclear weapons he'd ever heard. This is 40 years of work, and it's not exactly the same thing as, I think, anything that's been said before.
Okay. Anybody who's actually seen that happen, where somebody says, I believed this when I walked in this room, now I believe something completely different when I'm walking out of this room because of what was said here. That's what I want to hear. And the thing is that I don't even know how people really change their minds. I'm not sure. I think it doesn't happen in a lightning flash, on the road to Damascus kind of thing. I think it must happen kind of gradually as people participate in a whole bunch of different conversations. And if you measure what they're going to say in the last conversation, it would be quite different from what they said in the first, but that they don't know when they actually change their minds. And I can't even remember when I've changed my mind. So to me, that's a very interesting question. How do we get people to change their minds? And I'm impressed if you say that people say you've changed their minds, and well, I believe you. That's a good piece of that's a good story, and I think that's wonderful. That I better learn how to do it because I've never succeeded. Richard, have you ever succeeded?
Yes, I think there's numerous examples of success, Meta. A few years ago, we didn't think the Berlin Wall would fall down. It has. We didn't think that the Soviet Union would ever cease to exist. It has.
No, that's not what I mean.
But well, again,
but wait a minute. What I mean is, you're right. The changes, people change their minds, or the public opinion changes gradually, or something happens over time, so that for one period of time, opinions are different from what they are at a different point. What I'm saying is, when a person in your presence says, aha, you've convinced me, I've just changed my mind completely because you've made me believe that nuclear weapons are a bad thing where I thought they were a good thing. Right now, you've done that. No, I've never seen it happen.
Actually, if I could just jump in, most people don't think nuclear weapons are a good thing. Most people think nuclear weapons are a very dangerous thing that we have to put up with.
Right.
And that's the key part that you argue against, is not that they're good or bad, or, everyone knows they're dangerous. Everyone knows there's a danger from nuclear war. But the part that's got them is that they've been told again and again by experts and officials that nuclear weapons are never going to go away. And so they're a necessity. They'll always exist. And so you've got to keep them. And that's the piece that I focus on. And I've had this experience again and again. When I go into a room, I win the room. I get 60, 70% of the people in the room coming out agreeing with me. Large rooms full of retired people.
Hey, so what do you say? What is it that you tell them that makes them think it's not necessary?
Well, I say three things. One, I say technology goes away when it's dangerous and it's not very useful. And I give them a commonplace example. If I tried to sell you a stove and I said it was the greatest and all your neighbors had it and it would give you prestige with your friends, it's expensive, but it's the most technologically advanced stove there is. And you said, well, I'll do some research and I'll think about it. And you go online and discover that there are a bunch of people on a chat board that say, this stove won't even boil water. I can't even get it to cook anything. The stuff comes out lukewarm. And then there's another website where some other people say, my stove exploded. I wasn't even near it. It wasn't on. It just exploded and burned down my house, killed my dog. And there are 8, 10 people who've had the same experience. Would you buy that stove? Would you buy a stove that wasn't very useful and was dangerous? And if the answer is no, then you've defined how technology decisions are made. And the question then is, does that match nuclear weapons? Are they dangerous and are they useful? And the answer is, they're not very useful. Ike thought about using them in Korea and couldn't figure out how to do it in a useful way. They talked about using them in the Taiwan Straits crisis, but they eventually gave it up because it wasn't going to be useful. They offered them to the French at Dien Bien Phu. But the French turned them down because they couldn't figure out how to drop atomic bombs close enough to the Viet Minh to kill them without killing all the French soldiers that were surrounded. We talked about using nuclear weapons at Khe Sanh, but it wasn't even considered. And on and on and on. The military has never been a fan of actually using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And that's why it's not surprising that we removed 90%, 95% of our tactical nuclear weapons from Europe and left a small token handful as a symbolic commitment, because the weapons aren't very useful. And the military, at least, knows it. Now, so that's one piece. The other piece is deterrence dangerous? And the answer is, of course it's dangerous. Not because the machinery will fail, not because there's a flaw in the theory. The problem with deterrence is human beings. We run deterrence. We make the threats. We evaluate the threats. We decide how to respond to the threats. And the truth is, and everyone knows this from their own personal experience, human beings are flawed. We are prone to folly. And if human beings are the ones who run nuclear deterrence, and if human beings are prone to folly, then nuclear deterrence is inherently flawed. It cannot work forever. It will fail. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. So that sounds to me like a classic definition of, this is a piece of technology that is not very effective at any practical military use, and that in its supposedly ideal use, which is deterrence, it will fail. It is inherently flawed. That sounds to me like an open and shut case for getting rid of a particular kind of technology.
Okay, let's assume that you've got people agreed that yes, these things are bad, but you said they already came in the room believing that anyway. They
Right.
basically said, yes, they're bad, but on the other hand, if we don't have them, probably China will take over Taiwan, etc. Whatever happens to be. If we did, if we didn't have them and the Russians did, or the Russians, if neither of us had them, the Russians would go into Ukraine today, etc. So we need them, even though they are dangerous and they're risky, because the alternative is unacceptable. That is the argument they came in the room with, and you might have strengthened their desire to get rid of them as they leave the room, but I'm not sure that you've weakened the case for the view that they're necessary, from their point of view, necessary. And the other rationale that is, I think, the much more important reason for the existence of all kinds of weapons that we don't need, that are not good ideas, is that they're part of the economy, and people's livelihood depends upon producing them. And people are in the military, they've got their careers invested. If you shut down the number of people working on these things, we would have a big unemployment problem and all these things. So it's a matter of jobs, it's a matter of investment. You know, my pension fund, I don't think it's invested in nuclear weapons, but you know, there are a lot of pension funds that are. And what's going to happen to our pension if we take our money out of that, et cetera. So the financial incentives to produce and sell and potentially use nuclear weapons or any other weapon has to be, that's a rational argument, by the way. That's not an irrational argument. It's the real reason why the Canadian government right now will continue to fulfill its contractual obligations to sell armored personnel carriers to the Saudi Arabians, so they can maybe use them against Yemen. I don't know. The point is, it would be a very, very expensive decision to say break that contract, and the Canadian government's not going to do it. So, it's not irrational. I just happen to disagree with the morality of it.
Well, it seems to me that there are two questions that you're saying is how do you get from an argument that they're dangerous and not very useful to disarmament, which is a good question, and the question of financial incentives. And I think that financial incentives is the easier question because if you convince people that they're going to die if we don't get rid of nuclear weapons, that deterrence is inherently flawed and will fail, and they're pretty much convinced of that already. The International Red Cross did a survey of US millennials and found that 58% of millennials in the United States believe that a nuclear weapon will be used in the next 10 years. And the same percentage believe that a World War II type war will happen in their lifetime. So they think war is over the horizon, and probably nuclear war, because it's hard to imagine a World War II type war that involves all the world's powers and doesn't devolve into a nuclear war. So if your choice is between losing money and losing your life, you'll lose money. If your choice is between doing something different financially, the problem with the financial incentives argument is that people haven't ever been forced to confront the fact that deterrence will fail. Experts and officials are always telling us how they can manage deterrence and don't worry and it'll be all right. It's worked so far and blah, blah, blah. So I think financially is easy. The harder question is how do you get from, if you were able to have a lot of people, a lot of ordinary people who believe that nuclear weapons were clumsy, dangerous weapons, and that we ought to get rid of them, how does that translate into a world free of nuclear weapons? And the answer is, first you persuade the United States and you get the President of the United States to issue a statement that says nuclear weapons are obsolete. They've always been obsolete. They're bad weapons. We don't like them. We're going to invest in other fancy technology that we think is far more effective militarily. And we're not going to get rid of a single one of our nuclear weapons, but we're going to make this position our national policy. And we're going to do everything we can to persuade other nations to admit the reality that nuclear weapons were never anything other than clumsy, blundering weapons, and that we ought to get rid of them. Not so hard to get the Brits to come on board. 10% of their entire military budget goes to nuclear weapons. Possible maybe to get the Indians to come on board. They've always had a kind of, they've never been desperately enamored of nuclear weapons in the way that, say, Pakistan or North Korea has. China's always had a relatively disinterested view of deterrence. They, until quite recently, had as few as 20 missiles that could reach the United States. So they've never believed that they needed 70,000 nuclear weapons or 40,000 nuclear weapons in order to be able to deter. So if you begin to get worldwide agreement that the weapons are obsolete and ineffective, then it's quite easy to get a treaty. The chemical weapons treaty, once countries were on board, it didn't take 20 years to negotiate. It took a couple. Same with the biological weapons treaty. Once people kind of realized it's very hard to use biological weapons without getting your own people sick or killing your own soldiers or, targeting this city and accidentally getting the city of your ally that's next door. Once it became clear that they're very difficult weapons to use as weapons, biological treaty was negotiated in relatively short order. And if you had the same agreement worldwide, the nuclear weapons were not very useful, that would then getting rid of them becomes easy. The hard part is persuading people. Once you get to that, everyone would agree to come down at the same time. You'd have a treaty where all the weapons went away at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I agree with you, Ward, that, all of us want to get rid of nuclear weapons and have a nuclear-free world. And I think that there are many paths up the mountain. And I certainly applaud your rational basis. And I think I also would switch it around that we who are wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons are not idealists, are it is the people that want to keep them and think that an accident or a miscalculation or a terrorist is not going to happen. To me, those are the idealists.
Yes.
They're actually romantics. They're weapons romantics infatuated with the weapons. I agree.
Yeah. So, and I fully agree with you on all the other treaties. And now we have the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So, and to me, nuclear weapons are the most dangerous and worst weapon of mass destruction. It's the largest one. So we definitely need to get rid of it. The problem is to overcome all the lies and myths that people have been told for the last 100 years. And we've had nuclear weapons for now 75 years plus, say. And I think that's where the convincing comes. Now, Ronald Reagan said that he was convinced of nuclear weapons futility after seeing the movie The Day After. So again, that was an emotional point of view with the movie. And so I think that we need both. I think we need your rational approach, Ward. And I think also we need to look at it from an emotional point of view as well. And I think, Meta, that, we've got 70% of the people coming into the room that are convinced that nuclear weapons should be done away with. It's convincing the politicians. And to me, that's where the arguments need to be made. And I think, again, come back to the financial, as you point out.
Well, it's convincing those 70% of the people who are already persuaded that nuclear weapons are dangerous, that they can take action that will be effective. See, the great roadblock to effective work on nuclear weapons is that most people believe that nothing can be done. In fact, they don't even want to think about the problem because they think that their nuclear weapons are a danger they just have to live with. And if you have a danger that you just have to live with, the best way to deal with it is to put it out of your mind and don't think about it. Because if you think about it all the time and worry, you'll go crazy. The difference happens when you convince people that they can do something about nuclear weapons, that there is a logical, rational, realistic pathway to getting rid of them, and that they can do what their hearts want them to do. Their hearts and their morality say, we've got to get rid of these things. They're horrible. And that's right. But somehow the experts have brainwashed them in a way into thinking that nuclear weapons will always be with us. They're necessary. You can't get rid of them. It's only idealistic dreaming to believe that you can, blah, 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 blah. And that is the leg of the stool that I want to kick out from under them. I want to watch the experts sprawl on the floor with a surprised look on their faces saying, what? We're the realists. Actually, let me tell you a little story. A friend of mine organized a meeting for me in France, in Paris, at the National Assembly. It was in one of the conference rooms at the Assembly. And some of the leading nuclear weapons think tanks intellectuals in France were there. And a fellow who had a major role in one of the nuclear forces that France has. It has a land-based, it has a triad, I think, and several generals. And the meeting was under Chatham House rules, so I can't tell you who said what or who was there. But we laid out, my friend Jean-Marie and I laid out this kind of realist argument. We talked about how Hiroshima actually didn't force Japan to surrender. One of the reasons, and they're quite, French intellectuals are quite vulnerable because they only talk to each other and they've never heard a realist challenge to the notion that nuclear weapons are the most valuable, most important thing in the world. And they were simply stunned. They were like fish out of water, gasping. One of the military guys hung his head and afterwards shouted at Jean-Marie and said, "Why did you bring me into this meeting?" He was
I
obviously
love it.
deeply discouraged. So one of the advantages that we as anti-nuclear weapons activists have is that the nuclear weapons elite, and it's usually quite a small elite in a bunch of different countries, is largely unprepared to argue on a realist basis for nuclear weapons. They think they're realists, but they're not. They haven't really thought through their positions. Same is true in Israel. Israel, no one talks about nuclear weapons because it's almost illegal to say anything in Israel. So I think there's real scope for attacking the nuclear weapons experts and attacking the public from a direction that they don't expect, and saying, yes, they're immoral, but did you also realize they're not very useful weapons? They shouldn't be the currency of power. They should be the currency of foolishness. Or I don't know. I'm making
Okay, well, look, I tend to agree with your argument that the strongest case that you could use if you really want get people involved would be to convince them that there is a way to get rid of them, that it's not hopeless, that there are steps that can be taken that are real and meaningful. Because I do think that probably the majority of people in every country, in fact, I know from polls that it's true, they would like to get rid of nuclear weapons already, but they don't take action because it's like pie in the sky to them. It would be lovely if we could, but we know we can't, and there's nothing we can do about it, and so on. So if you have some formula for that's convincing about how we can do something about it that will work, by all means, that is probably the best thing that you could share with people.
Well,
I don't know what it might be.
let me just say, the reason I got in touch with you and wanted to get on your show, and thank you for having me, is that I just recently published a 4-part article in Ink Stick, INK Stick, called How to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons. And it lays out this case that there are very few facts and they're open to doubt. The current expert consensus could well be wrong. Technology goes away differently than the experts believe. Weapons aren't very useful and the deterrence will fail. And I think it makes in outline the case that the book that I'm working on, the realist case for eliminating nuclear weapons, makes. So I encourage people to have a look.
Okay, yeah, but still, let's go back to this. Let's assume you've got everybody convinced of all of these things. They can still say, yeah, you're right, but we can't do anything about it. And that's where, if you now have another 0.7 or 8 or whatever it is, that should be one saying, yes, here's what we're going to do. Here's our game plan. First we do this. First we take Manhattan and then we take Berlin.
Well, I think the first thing you do is you acknowledge the reality in the field. The reality is nuclear weapons policy is made by a very small group of experts and government officials that move back and forth between academia and government, and their minds probably can't be changed. You need a couple of those people to ratify your point of view. Just like in the Reformation, you needed a few Catholic priests who would convert to Protestantism to make it all right for the lay people to believe this new form of religion. But by and large, you're not going to convince the experts. Their jobs and identities are built into this. They depend on it. So what you need to do is you need a broad-based popular movement that says, these are clumsy, stupid weapons, let's get rid of them, and forces politicians to take a second look. And politicians are persuadable with votes. So it doesn't matter whether they're nuclear believers or not, politicians can be pressured. And once you start getting politicians throughout government at the local level and the regional level, state, federal, then you're on your way to building a national consensus. And suddenly the media starts to cover it more, and there are more conversations about the whole question, and the movement builds and builds, and you end up with a declaration by the president that says, we think nuclear weapons are obsolete. We're going to convince everyone else that they are as well. And, you know, consider the United States invented nuclear weapons. We were first. And if we're the ones who say, well, they're really obsolete now, that carries a lot of weight with people. And, you know, if you got a coalition, let's imagine a coalition of the US, the UK, and India going around and leaning on the other, or persuading the other nuclear states and saying, we'll get rid of them if you'll get rid of them. And China saying, well, okay, we, you know, if that's what it's going to be. And then the Russians and the North Koreans and the Israelis are the hard, and the Pakistanis are the hard cases. But China leans on Pakistan and North Korea. We lean on Israel. And then you just have to get the Russians and their holdout. But it's not an easy task, but it's clearly not an impossible task. It's doable. And that's the kind of possibility, that's the kind of realistic approach that I think would inspire people to follow their hearts and say, yeah, I've hated these weapons since I was a child. I want to do something. Tell me what to do.
Well, I certainly agree with your Ward, and we need to work with you in Rotary.
I would love that. I think Rotary is a perfect organization because it's nonpartisan, and you know, you argue rationality and reason, and it's hard for them to say no. In fact, I had a great experience at Rotary. I went to Tennessee to give a series of talks on nuclear weapons at Rotary clubs, and I gave a short version of some of these arguments. And one of the guys, a gentleman in the front row with a suit, stood up and said, well, now, Ward, that's a very persuasive argument, and I'm sure all of us agree with you. And then everyone in the room did kind of seem to agree. And it was only afterwards that he introduced himself. He was a 4-star general, retired, former commander of all forces in Korea, and executive officer to General Schwarzkopf in the Gulf War. And he said, you know, you got to go to all these Rotary clubs. You got to persuade people. So I think Rotary is my experience is it's a place where some people object, but it's, you know, it's a great way to get at people, get to people that normally the anti-nuclear movement passes by.
Next week, I have these schmooze things every week. And one of them will be with a guy, will be largely about India. And one of the guys is, Richard knows too, his name is Chand. And that's what he does. He's a Rotarian, and he goes around Rotary clubs all over India, giving lectures during their lunch meetings, I gather, about against nuclear weapons. I guess, you know, if all of us would pick some club or church, you know, if I belong to the Anglican church, if maybe I'd go to every Anglican church in town and talk about nuclear weapons. I don't know how I'd get them to listen, though.
Well, you should talk to Tyler Wigg Stevenson, who's an Anglican minister in Toronto, and he, in another life, was one of the founders of the evangelical movement against nuclear weapons, and talked the Evangelical Worldwide Alliance to take a policy position against nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So, and he probably knows how to get you in.
Well, there are certainly places we could do. I think public libraries, we could hold meetings, places like that. I think that is maybe as useful a thing as we can do, but I like personally sitting at my computer. So I'll continue making videos and hope that other people will share them. Now, if we can get somebody to share this conversation, this particular video with their Rotary Club or something, maybe we'll have some impact, you think? Okay, with that, Richard, you that's a thumbs up.
You bet.
Thumbs up.
Good. Okay. Well, this has been fun, and I appreciate it very, very much. And certainly, I want to give you every bit of support in what you're doing. I hope it all works. Obviously, we're all for it, and onward. Okay. Thanks so much. Okay. See you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Meta, and really good to meet you, Ward.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Meta.